thank you all for coming. I'm Stephen Noerper. I'm the Senior Director for Policy here at the Korea Society, and it's wonderful to have you. I see many of our friends and supporters in the audience, and thank you for coming on a bad weather day. We're very impressed that you took the time to join us. And I'm very pleased to have John Park here, the director of the Working Group on Korea at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School. John is always one of our favorite guests. He's been here over the years now as a strong supporter of the Korea Society and clearly a visionary for his work at Harvard. He does have some roots in New York City, given his time with Goldman. And so it's always it makes us happy to have him back here at the Korea Society. And he's coming clearly at a most pertinent time with these new developments. And so when we originally set up our discussion, we did want to look at an update on Korea Inc., which was a fundamentally important report that John and Jim Walsh out of MIT did. But we also were keen to expand upon the headlines of the day. And we'll give you plenty of opportunity here to question John on that beyond my questions and discussion, and to press whatever points you would like so that we can get further into these potentially amazing developments. But John, thank you. Thank you for taking the time. And I see we have Canvas here from Bloomberg, Rob from South China Morning Post, Pamela Falk from CBS. So thank you for taking the time. You're really a distinguished group, and we're much honored. And we're much honored to have you back at a potentially historic time, and clearly at I think what we'd agree is a watershed moment that so far from Washington has received a cautious response. The president trying to express support through at least conditioning it as a potentially sincere approach, and that there may be an opening here, though as he also tweeted, the United States is willing to go hard either way. And we most definitely have the Moon Jae-in administration having the opportunity to build an Olympic moment, potentially into an Olympic movement, and de-escalate tensions around the peninsula. Clearly, the inter-Korean process is a big part and parcel of that. I think you bring us a broader vision as well, because you've really been one of our national experts looking at the sanctions effect. And perhaps, John, you might want to start with a bit of kind of overview and conditioning in terms of how you see the balance of maximum pressure, sanctions biting, the New Year's address, and the inter-Korean dynamic.
First off, thank you very much for having me, and thank you all for coming out today. I think one way to start it is with the name of the U.S. administration's North Korea policy, and that's maximum pressure and engagement. So start from the big picture and get to the details. With that, there is one working definition of maximum pressure, and we all understand it, and the countries working on maximum pressure operate according to that definition. We have military pressure and economic pressure. And under economic pressure, we're seeing targeted sanctions and now moving to broader economic embargoes and things that are much more expansive that we've seen in the past. One thing to observe, though, is that there are now two working definitions of engagement. The Blue House's definition seems to be one of, as long as South Korea is engaging North Korea, there is a reduction of the likelihood of some kind of military action by the United States. The U.S. definition of engagement is that it's a means to coordinate with friends and allies to increase on economic pressure, I should say, on the sanctions piece. Until we see a closure of that gap and the adoption and the use of one definition of engagement, that is a source of concern for me, that could be the basis of more divergence between Seoul and Washington, as we see the Blue House taking the initiative to try to keep this momentum going from the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, and as you mentioned, going all the way to Kim Jong-un's statement in the New Year's address. So with that, if we move into the details, a couple of things to parse out. One is, what has been the headlines? If you trace it back, we are still seeing these things reported from the South Korean perspective. So the South Korean delegation coming back and reporting that North Korea is ready to engage in talks with the United States. And later this week, we're expecting National Security Advisor Chung and NIS, National Intelligence Service Director Seo, to come to Washington and debrief their U.S. administration counterparts. So I think there are details remain to be seen. I don't think we have the full picture yet. It is an optimistic beginning, but I think guarded optimism right now is one way to frame it. Excuse me. The other piece of the detail, I think when we look at it from a transaction, if you think of it as a business deal, who gets what out of this, if in fact this is what we are seeing in terms of broad efforts to further on the inter-Korean dialogue, and with the announcement of the summit to take place between President Moon and Kim Jong-un towards the end of April. Who benefits? And I think from a South Korean perspective, it goes back to the view that as long as they're engaging, there's an opportunity to create space for diplomacy and reduce the likelihood of some kind of military action. That's an assumption. I think the viewpoint in Washington is different in the sense that July of last year, when North Korea conducted their first intercontinental ballistic missile, July 4th, and a very short period of time later, a few weeks later, July 28th, conducted their second ICBM test. These capabilities were estimated to be able to range the American homeland. So North Korea, I would say in July, became, before that, a problem over there, a threat to American interests and American allies, to something that was a direct threat to the American homeland. And with that, the South Korean press has the phrase Korea passing, and the concern that the fate of Korea is being determined by the great powers. In a way, July, in an operational sense, has become Korea past. North Korea is now viewed as a direct threat to the United States. And as such, it looks like it's displaced terrorism as the #1 threat to the American homeland. So it gives you a sense of the prioritization in dealing with the Korean Peninsula and the threat emanating from North Korea. The second piece I wanted to highlight is when we look at these movements towards engagement. Last year was interesting because China was very active, and what political capital it had, it didn't hesitate in using that to move the double freeze proposal forward and trying to get traction on that. So this idea of getting the North Koreans to freeze their nuclear and ballistic missile testing activity, and for the United States and South Korea to freeze their military exercises. Secretary Tillerson, in the Vancouver multilateral meeting that he co-hosted with the Canadian foreign minister, in the press conference, basically took the wind out of those sails, basically saying that it was false equivalency, what the North Koreans were doing, essentially banned by successive UN Security Council resolutions. What the United States and South Korea was doing by way of military exercises, very legitimate within the military alliance structure for defensive purposes. Interestingly, though, during the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics and even now, we almost see an ad hoc double freeze in place. It is something that I think the South Korean government is trying to solidify more, but it has been extended. And with this latest diplomatic overture, the hope to get the U.S. on board and have these direct talks between the United States and North Korea. The final point I mentioned in terms of framing comments, the bar is very, very high for the United States. And I think it's reflective of the events of July. North Korea is not the type of threat that it was before. The sense of urgency of this administration is real. And we see the reuse of the term CVID, complete, verifiable, irreversible disarmament, but that becoming in many respects an early phase goal as opposed to aspirational working towards CVID and denuclearization. There's, I think, room, and the art of diplomacy, we'll see what the main officials who will be assigned to this task, how they start to explore the creativity on the diplomatic side. But those are the gaps, and I think that's the lay of the land as we see it right now.
Just to press you a little bit more, if you had to look at the distribution here of what have been push effects, how do you weigh maximum pressure and the White House campaign along with Abe and along with a component that Moon has also articulated? He's expressing both conservative and progressive aspects in some of his statements, saying we need readiness as well as cautious optimism. How much do you see it as soul driving the process, and this being a Moon Jae-in priority that comes out of his work in the earlier progressive or reformist administrations? How much do you see of it as a product of North Koreans feeling that embargo or the impact of sanctions, and either turning with the Pyongyang policy from nuclear weapons to economic modernization that would necessitate that? And how much of it would be the strategy you oft hear in the press by some analysts and commentators that it's wedge tactics? It's really designed to split the United States and South Korea and to cause complications in the alliance.
One way to parse that, causal reasons for why this happened, and then the notion of positive and negative unintended consequences from this action. Under the heading of causal, there's a saying within policy circles, it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. I think there's a lot of initiative being taken by the Blue House given the urgency of the situation. Some semblance of coordination before actions, but a lot of coordination after. So the idea of keeping this momentum going and the definition of the South Korean side of what engagement means, I think we see rising to the surface. The part of moving forward along these lines, again, as a transaction, what does North Korea get out of this, and what is the motivation? This is the difficulty. You can analyze capabilities, and we've seen that last year with the ballistic missile testing, the ICBMs, the nuclear tests, but intentions, motivations, notoriously difficult to gauge. If you look at the different schools of thought, the technical community believes that North Korea still has more testing to do before they have minimal viable product, a prototype. Kim Jong-un, in the very same New Year's address where he expressed pride, Korean pride, in a successful Winter Olympics and encouragement and support to make that happen, in that very same New Year's Day address, he also stated that North Korea this year would begin mass producing nuclear weapons. Technical experts are saying before you can do mass production, you need to have a viable prototype. Hence their view that we'll see some more testing when the North Koreans are ready. Under that school of thought, North Korea is going to need time. The lapse of time between the September test and then what became what we now know as the Hwasong-15, the latest ICBM test, which had the ability to range the continental United States, there was that quiet period. And many had thought that this was the beginning of a breakthrough, that North Korea was preparing to enter into negotiations. And then on November 28th, we found out what the North Koreans were really doing. As the North Koreans get to the next stage, which is more technology intensive and more technical, if they were going to have that pause anyway, the school of thought here is why not frame it as a freeze and get something for it? And that's something that we'll have to wait and see. Another school of thought is that sanctions are working, and this is the sign that maximum pressure brought North Korea to the table. The perennial challenge in the sanctions analysis piece, how do we know if sanctions are working or not? The metrics argument. There have been efforts in the past to look at GDP numbers. For North Korea, that's very difficult. But one, I think, interesting development is smuggling activity. This was clearly picked up by the UN panel of experts. Big focus of media attention on this as well. So the notion of Russian companies involved with smuggling and Chinese companies, shipping companies flagged out of Hong Kong, it was a network and a good example of a coping mechanism and how the North Korean regime certainly sustains a setback, but how they innovate and develop new practices and have this development of a coping mechanism. We're seeing that online, and I think that is an objective metric, an indicator that these measures are having an impact. But if we carry that analysis further in secondary and tertiary spaces, we see this type of resilience in many respects. It's not total compensation for the amount that had been reduced, but certainly this coping mechanism. And the mechanism there that is interesting to understand as we see the market forces play out. When you do target an item, a commodity, and reduce quantity, in the marketplace, it spikes up price, and that's the incentivization of the smuggling activity. So from that perspective, there is something to be said about these measures having an impact. But then the question, is it sufficient enough to explain Kim Jong-un coming to the table as the South Koreans are reporting? I think there's still more to assess to arrive at that kind of conclusion. But one part of the notion of Kim Jong-un declaring that he is interested in denuclearization talks, I think is the aspect also taking into consideration how far advanced he is. The program is something that we can measure. So under Kim Jong-il's time of 17 years of rule, he had 16 significant ballistic missile tests, 1-6. Under a little over 6 years of Kim Jong-un's time in leadership role, he's conducted 85. So you get the sense of working towards technical achievement as opposed to a price tag. But there's still this view that the father's playbook is still at play. And I think there are certain elements of it. But when it comes to the progress of the development of these capabilities, the idea of having his own security guarantee, that's the one that's a little difficult to square right now, because one of the basis of the statement reportedly coming from North Korea is they would engage in denuclearization if their security is guaranteed and the military threat is eliminated. That is a big if.
How do you see this leadership? And I think this is an interesting photo for the background as well as the foreground. There's been a very strong, in sending his sister, a strong message to South Korea that we're engaging at the senior-most level. You see that in terms of the reception of the South Korean delegation. There has been some urging that the Americans now consider sending a either senior delegation or a senior representative to see if we can directly broach talks with the Kim Jong-un regime in advance of a more formal sit-down. What do you see as the impulses or the next steps for Washington? And let's throw the military exercises into the mix, because clearly trying to find that which seemingly was acknowledged as being okay and understandable for April may be different by the time we get to the later exercises.
There is a diplomatic opening, further exploring and ascertaining what the opening, the details of it, the conditions, or if they're framed as the absence of conditions, but certainly what some basis of moving forward, what those factors may be. It's an important element of exploring that in a structured manner. So my colleague, Dr. Gary Seymour, has been advocating the appointment of a U.S. presidential envoy to keep this process of further exploring what the parameters may look like and seeing if there's a basis of moving forward. I think that's a prudent step to take. It doesn't mean that we're embarking in negotiations right away. A lot has happened in a short period of time. Taking stock of that, calibrating how this may be the basis of something more formal is, I think, something, again, that is prudent to explore. To the point of the military exercises, though, we're hearing different things. Reportedly, again, from the South Korean side, Kim Jong-un, quote unquote, understands and is okay with the upcoming resumption of the postponed military exercises. But if you look at that conditional statement, that is not a permanent feature. If the conditional statement, North Korea would denuclearize if security is guaranteed and the military threat is eliminated. The military threat from the North Korean perspective has consistently been the military exercises. So from that perspective, again, the military exercise component puts the focus on the U.S.-South Korea dynamic. We've seen some early indications from the South Korean side to pare down the military exercises. But I think, largely from a U.S. military perspective, there is a very specific purpose of the U.S. military exercises, in that about a 14-month mandatory military service for South Korea, having one full military exercise cycle is important to make sure that South Korean and U.S. forces have the ability to coordinate and are trained to respond in a military fashion. So if those were reduced and somehow became less of a feature of the training cycle, there's a concern about the fighting readiness and for defense purposes. This is all playing out. There are many issues and concerns being laid out there, but I think a part of the appointing of a U.S. presidential envoy and further exploring the basis of the conditions and the factors being in place for moving forward with this overall would be based largely on this calculation of setting the priorities. We can't address all the concerns at once, but this is an opportunity, I think, to fully engage in terms of at least exploring it.
Let's turn to China for a bit, because I know you spent a lot of time on this, and it's come out in your report in North Korea Inc. It's also been something that you've packed our house twice on in terms of Korea-China relations, and in particular the North Korea variable there. By all accounts, it seems that China has been doing quite a bit more on the sanctions issue. The White House has said as much. The Xi Jinping administration has argued that they are doing as much as they possibly can, and since the fourth nuclear test have been co-sponsors and certainly supporters of the United Nations Security Council processes in these regard. You've mentioned that There have also been some violations associated with both China and Russia that have been fairly widely reported. How do you see the balance of China's leadership, their commitment, the impact by way of the central bank, which has also made comments in this regard, movement, and then the trading companies and the smaller banks, some of whom don't want to touch this any longer because there's too high of a carrying cost?
From the top levels, we have seen more. The Chinese authorities were very keen on showing that the sectoral ban was a top priority, and their statistics show that they have shut down in terms of purchasing North Korean coal, as it directly relates to prior UN Security Council resolutions and the more recent ones as well. And with respect to reducing the flow of oil and petroleum products into North Korea, that's a significant reduction as well. But the main action that we saw last year, I think that is important to note, was China going out of its way to try to get traction on this dual freeze proposal. That was framed as the diplomatic off-ramp. The Russians were on board as well in terms of trying to move that forward, but no traction. So in many respects, I think you see behind the scenes China encouraging and certainly welcoming this inter-Korean dialogue, because as I was mentioning earlier, it is an ad hoc, de facto dual freeze. How long it lasts for is a question mark. But in practice, I think we're seeing that, and the reason why I think China is very supportive of it. Going forward, though, China, as much as they're concerned about the elevated risk of potential escalation, inadvertent escalation, the signs of China being proactive in putting other types of pressure on the table, military pressure, I think the signs aren't past a certain threshold to say that China's moving in that direction. But the diplomatic efforts, I think for the Chinese side, that certainly has been the priority and will continue to be the priority. And there's been talk of reviving, if this track continues, reviving the six-party talks. So I would imagine that in Beijing, this is a time of tempered optimism, but also this idea that it's a fleeting moment. And so where China decides to invest this political capital, that's something that we'll be watching very closely.
Let me then end then before we turn to
Sure.
the audience with two other variables, since
Yes.
you've mentioned a multilateral process in terms of dialogue. And one is, where does this leave the Japanese? One of the reports today out of the journal was essentially the Japanese are concerned because of this inter-Korean progress. Already they've had the difficulties on the history and popular memory front with South Korea,
Right.
which as recently as the Olympics was a point of contention. We had Moon Jae-in cautioning the Japanese that there's an ethnic dynamic and basically don't get in the way of the Minjuk on this. We're managing this process. And you have an Abe who's standing shoulder to shoulder with Trump on a harder line approach. And then secondly, how do you figure in the Russian variable? Putin will, clearly be in on his perhaps last term here very soon. Will the Russians maybe lean in more on this? Can they be of assistance if we get beyond this impasse in Russia-U.S. relations?
Sure. So the maximum pressure and engagement naming of it is something of a formula that you can assess how countries are dealing with North Korea. And it's not to say that Japan is all maximum pressure and South Korea is all engagement, but on a scale, certainly South Korea is closer to the engagement side of it on the scale, and Japan is closer to the maximum pressure side of that scale. But as long as the Blue House is coordinating with the White House, concerns emanating from Tokyo, I think, would be muted. But if there is daylight between Seoul and Washington, I think that's where the Japanese pressure increases. The concern that North Korea is carrying out the first interpretation, that first school of thought that North Korea sees an opportunity, is using the period of being quiet in order to prepare for the next phase of testing, frame it as a freeze, and essentially sell the freeze, if you will. So this is where I think the coordination is important, and we're going to see the outcome of the consultations from National Security Advisor Chung and NIS Director Seo very soon. So that is the next piece of it. But the takeaway, this is moving extremely fast. It is unbelievable if you think of the time period. The Olympic torch, the flame went out, but it's still hot. You can't touch it. That kind of level of how quickly South Korea moved forward with this engagement of North Korea and the announcement of the summit, the third summit between the two Koreas, which will take place in April, next month.
Which last poll I saw enjoys 68% public support, which is not an insignificant number.
From a domestic South Korean viewpoint, the polls have showed the big source of concern is potential military action from the United States. And I think there's a larger, broader South Korean view that if there is engagement of North Korea, it reduces the likelihood of military action. Again, an assumption that we have to revisit. But from the Russia piece of this, it's interesting that their most vocal involvement in this was to support and back and invest their political capital in the Chinese effort with a dual freeze. It was interesting towards the end of last year, though, you had President Putin comment that in this round of the North Korean nuclear crisis, Kim Jong-un had won. And so his assessment is one that the momentum is really in the North Korean side, but gives a sense also of how the nature as the Russian side is viewing the situation. Unlikely to stop on the North Korean piece of it in terms of from the calculus of where they sit and given the challenges that the North Korean regime faces, that for them it's logical that Kim Jong-un would work towards demonstration and prototype and building out an arsenal for minimal deterrent purposes. I think that assessment is quite strong on the Russian side and also a source of concern that we're going to see elevated tensions if we don't have some kind of diplomatic off-ramp. So the Russian piece in all of this is interesting in terms of how you have symmetry on the diagnosis side from the Russian and the Chinese side. You have coordination in pushing forward on the dual freeze. And I think right now we're seeing dual support from Moscow and Beijing in terms of trying to keep this inter-Korean dialogue moving forward.
Yeah, very interesting. John Park, thank you. And now let's turn to your questions. Please, if you just wait for the microphone so that those who are live streaming now can hear your questions. And please identify yourself by name and affiliation. You want to move the mic up front here, Jonathan? Thank you.
Hi, Homer Williams. I'm retired and I'm a member of the Korea Society. I'm wondering how the lack of current U.S. expertise on Korea would play into this, with Victor Cha dropping out of as ambassador, no current ambassador there, and Mr. Yoon retiring.
One way to initially respond to that is that was a question that the State Department spokesperson mentioned after Ambassador Joseph Yoon announced his resignation. And the State Department administration view is that they have lots of Korea expertise. You have the head of the Korea desk at the State Department. You have the acting ambassador in Seoul who has the Korea expertise. So their view is that's the part that they're not on the lacking of the equation. So their view is it's not a lack of Korea expertise within the U.S. administration, U.S. government, that is a source of concern, very much the view of North Korea and what Kim Jong-un is doing. But in many respects, another interpretation of it is because of the events of July, North Korea, the quick elevation of the threat from North Korea being the number one threat to the American homeland, I think that the calculations at play are at a very high level. So with that, it's binary in terms of how you deal with North Korea. You try to enter into some kind of diplomatic arrangement, or you think of the military option in terms of how this administration is viewing it. I think we're seeing an acceleration of that viewpoint. And the introduction of Korean expertise to that, at this state with that kind of momentum, one wonders how much that's going to have an impact given the very accelerated basis of moving forward in dealing with North Korea.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Park, for your comments. It's Pamela Falk from CBS News. You mentioned the panel of experts, the UN Sanctions Committee. They are coming out with officially, even though we've all reported it, the report next week, which will give it a little bit more broad support or interest. And we've covered the sanctions skirting and the Syria aid. But there's also a list of 56 entities and vessels that the U.S. has submitted, and it's being held up by China. So do you see that as China protecting North Korea? And what do you think North Korea expects in terms of sanctions relief for this diplomatic initiative. Finally, just on the U.S. potential envoys, playing off the last question, are there any names you can think of? Is this something you'd be interested in or be considered for? And thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. So for the first one, the shipping companies, they are tied to larger business interests. So the initial Chinese concerns about somehow offending the North Koreans at an earlier phase when we saw the application of sanctions, I think that's been largely replaced by concerns that they actually hurt Chinese businesses and companies. These are shipping entities that are tied to broader shipping entities overall and networks, if you will. There's a group out of Washington called the Center for Advanced Defense Studies, C4ADS. They've actually been using data analytics, so Palantir and Panjiva, the shipping data, and they've been able to use the data analytics to triangulate what these networks look like, and they're massive. So from a Chinese concern, if you designate one of these entities, this idea that you essentially affect a whole network is a big part of commercial interests overall for the Chinese. The second piece of it, when you look at the sanctions relief piece, the U.S. administration has been very consistent. Sanctions relief only comes with denuclearization. And under this administration, I don't think there's much wiggle room for that. Now, certainly South Korea has applied their own sanctions. There are things called the May 24 sanctions. There's a direct response in 2010 when the North Koreans sank a South Korean corvette in March of 2010. So South Korea could lift their own sanctions, but some of these measures have an interconnected aspect as well, that if South Korea views it as a sovereignty issue and they can lift their own sanctions, the networking aspect of sanctions could be a broader consideration as well, how South Korea would untangle that. And to the third point, I'm actually a Canadian citizen, so if they appointed me as an American ambassador, that would be truly an interesting feat.
Any name?
The area that I think is interesting is former U.S. generals, one area of candidacy that's being broadly discussed, and another basically close political relationships with President Trump. But in the latter case, there wouldn't be a prioritization on getting an ambassador with Korea expertise. It would be more proximity to the president. Thank you.
Rob.
Thank you very much. Robert Delaney with the South China Morning Post. I just wanted to ask if you could let us know what is your understanding of what is happening this week in Washington with the arrival of Mr. Chung Eui-yong, who's recently been in Pyongyang. Where do you expect those meetings to go? Do you have any idea who he's meeting with? And then another question is a separate question related to the ship-to-ship transfers, the smuggling. On the one hand, you were saying that China's been very active in cutting off or drastically reducing its trade, yet some of these transactions are happening with Chinese vessels. Any comment about how distant those vessels are, their shipping companies are from the Chinese government? Are they really actively trying to clamp down on that? And just sort of an economics question. I understand you were saying that the clampdown on the trade will raise the prices of these commodities, which then incentivizes the activity. But if we're talking about coal shipments, I mean, coal is more of I would think it's more of a worldwide commodity. I'm not quite sure how that plays out if it's just limited quantities.
Sure.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm trying to remember all these questions. So the first one, as it relates to who they'll meet, National Security Advisor Chung has a good working relationship with National Security Advisor Lieutenant General McMaster. So clearly that one's on the docket. How it might broaden out to other members of the administration, that remains to be seen. But the White House National Security Council interactions, definitely the primary focus. The explanation of what happened in Pyongyang is going to be a key part of it. There was a 6-point agreement that came out, but National Security Advisor Chung also mentioned that there were things discussed in secret, and that is only for U.S. ears, and that creates a lot of anticipation what that might be. So that's a part that we're waiting to potentially hear about, if that becomes a basis sufficient for the U.S. side to move forward in terms of talks. But the U.S. administration has made very, very clear that moving forward with talks has nothing to do with this idea of this being an actual negotiation. So they've differentiated the two, which creates some space, I think, if there is sufficient indications from the North Korean side. To your second point about the shipping, if it's tied to Chinese government, Chinese authorities, the shipping part of it is the incredibly tangled web. If you look at the earlier reports of some of these vessels, there was a Taiwanese shipping company that was involved as well. So you get a sense of essentially the network and how this is all involved there, and some of the shipping licenses and the documentation taking place in Hong Kong. So this is a part of the shipping industry, as it will. And if you look at the Chinese authorities and how they explain it, these are private entities doing criminal activities in some instances. That's not the characterization of all of them, but that's the broader differentiation and the explanation that this isn't somehow Chinese state sanctioned. To your third question, you're absolutely right. These are global commodities. But if you think of proximity and access, that's a big element as well. So if you think of transportation costs embedded in selling commodities and purchasing commodities, if they're right there, there's a competitive advantage of getting some kind of source from it. Transshipment gives one way to mask origin, and I think is a direct risk-taking in order to get the benefit of having something that doesn't require sunk costs related to the transportation of it.
Please.
Hi, Josh from Victory Capital. I'm interested in your view on like top priorities for China, South Korea, Russia, and then even Japan. If we assume that the U.S. does invade North Korea, and my mental model is Iraq, where there was a lot of planning on the military and then fell short on the economic side. So assuming that there's a lot of planning on the economic side post-invasion, what does that dialogue look like with all of the interested parties?
I think there's just the primary focus on dealing with this immediate threat. And so with the planning and other aspects of it, there's a working assumption there's got to be some kind of plan. I'm sure there are plans, but the question is how updated are those plans? The working assumption is if there is some kind of conflict with the North Korean regime is removed or implodes, then you would have de facto unification where South Korea extended sovereignty over the North, and you had reunification on South Korean terms. But if you look at some of these scenarios, if they play out, if there is escalation, inadvertent or planned, and you see the elimination of the North Korean regime, from a Chinese calculus, it's not that they're proactive about it, but if you look at that stage when you run it through, you have lead elements of the North Korean regime embedded in the Chinese marketplace. These are senior Workers' Party of Korea officials doing business through these elite North Korean state trading companies, North Korea Inc. They would inherit those individuals if they wanted to, and this is optionality. This is not to say it's preordained, but they have the building blocks to develop and essentially introduce a new leadership group. This would be a pro-China group. They would be very focused on more of the commercial economic development side of things because that's their DNA. I'm sure they would be more amenable if there is that deal of greater market access, greater economic opportunities, and at that point, reconstruction of North Korea in return for full access, making sure all the facilities are accounted for, full denuclearization. We may see the perpetuation of the division of the Korean Peninsula. So that's an element of it that it's not going to be the clear-cut understandings from before. In many respects, we're somewhat in uncharted territory. And again, just the scenario aspect of it. In scenario, there's a lot of creativity in these scenario discussions. It's not to say that it's grounded in reality. There's only a linear path forward. But one possibility is that if you look at One Belt, One Road, AIIB, a lot of these organizations can be geared towards the reconstruction aspect of it. One of the interesting things about South Korea is that the vast majority of the national wealth, so if you think of high net worth individuals, they've plowed their money into the local real estate and local stock market. If there are hostilities on the Korean Peninsula and extends into South Korea and Seoul as well, you're going to have large portions of South Korean national wealth wiped out. So there, if you think of how this all plays out, I think it's not as clear cut and it's not along the lines of our previous understandings. The dynamics have changed a lot.
Okay, let me just parse a little bit here. So on this whole idea of a cadre that has been fostered by China, which probably at the military level there's some, the rationale for the assassination, well, the execution of Jung Sun-taek is that he had gotten too close and was misusing funds associated with China. And similarly, that the Kim Jong-nam assassination had something to do with being outside of Chinese protection and maybe being held or protected by China as an alternative. It seems that, too, there has been discussion between the Americans and the Chinese about alternative regimes. Your thoughts on that, and also the question is really getting to the complexity of what happens. I mean, we know, for example, we've talked a lot here about Victor Cha's feelings on the Bloody Nose campaign, and that has been a consistent theme in our programs about the dangers of military strike and about what the follow-on effects would be. But clearly the management aspects on any number of fronts, the role for the United Nations, which would clearly entail altered roles and missions, refugee flows, et cetera, and the pandemics that go with them, control of the nuclear stockpile, and what would be Chinese, American, ROK priorities and agreements or understandings on the control of those stockpiles, environmental, ecological, meltdown, many other concerns. And then you get to infrastructure, agriculture, energy, nutrition, medical care. Maybe you can, give us some of those thoughts or boil those down a little bit for us. Clearly, a managerial challenge that would be quite awesome.
Maybe we can be snowed in and carry this conversation overnight as well.
Well, no, we're almost there. It looks like everybody's staying for the day.
So I would respond with two anecdotes. When I was at the U.S. Institute of Peace, I had colleagues who ran the Baghdad office, and this was a post-reconstruction type of situation, and invited them to some of the scenario discussions about potential scenarios on the Korean Peninsula. One of the interesting insights from those discussions, the goalposts change. You think if you reconstitute the way it was before, the goalposts change in the sense of the population, their expectations change. So one of the things that was used as an example, as you had a post-war Iraq, the middle class came in from Jordan, the diaspora came back. They brought appliances with them, air conditioners. And so reconstituting the electricity grid and having input based on output, based on previous averages, no longer was sufficient. So they had mass blackouts. And that was not the only, but a big part of popular backlash and criticism of the authorities, either from the U.S. side or the provisional government on the Iraqi side. So it gives you a sense of how the planning of these things, they change dramatically based on what configuration you have after the conflict, and especially if some kind of hostilities are stabilized as well. So that's the whole lessons learned from the Iraq case that we can view as one interpretation of how difficult and complex it would be. The other thing to remember is that South Korea is an OECD country. We haven't had a conflict zone with an OECD country. So the other thing for this group and members of this group, it's something that hits close to home. South Korea is a pillar in the global supply chain for technology. And it doesn't have to be full-scale war. Even if it's limited hostilities, if South Korea is knocked off from that as a primary provider of memory chips, a lot of the circuitry electronics that go into smartphones and other high-end electronic goods, a lot of that is directly sourced from South Korea. So the broader view in Washington that ultimately if we do something militarily, that it'll be over there, the global impact would hit us in ways that in hindsight it's so clear. But right now there's a lot of prioritization and a lot of focus on things along the lines of Bloody Nose and other aspects of it. But at the end of the day, it is the Iraq example and colleagues from that time period, they're just saying that it's messy and it gets messier as opposed to you get some handle of it and then you move forward some kind of plan.
Yeah. As I tell my students up at Columbia in the International Relations of Northeast Asia, yes, we're talking about the 11th largest economy, but the 11th largest economy is surrounded by the first, second, and third largest economies. So the potential impact of a conflagration beyond military aspects is enormous. Let's take a question from one of our live stream viewers, Jonathan Corrado, our Associate Director.
So I'll read this out. This is from Kevin Dunn. The question is, in the longer term, would an energetic interdiction of North Korea's state-run nuclear program set a useful precedent against future pursuits of nuclear weapons for non-state actors? So the phrase energetic interdiction is a bit ambiguous, so you can interpret that however you'd like.
Right. One of the things about the North Korean nuclear program right now is that it's very far advanced. And the ideas of a number of different policy options and actions that we can apply to North Korea, very objectively, we have to manage our expectations. North Korea, from the nuclear proliferation technical field, the assessment is North Korea is a nuclear weapon state at the regional level, like it's a Pakistan. But North Korea is claiming that it's P6 right now, that it's joined the elite group of countries that have intercontinental range. So that's a part where you certainly could try to carry out these other measures, but the implications of it this far advanced, I think, is a big source of concern. For those who look at the nuclear proliferation cases, because we haven't had this situation of a nuclear weapon state where you're going to try to use military force at the conventional level to denuclearize them, it's a field where right now a lot of theories are being tested and new theories are being developed, but it gives you a sense that we're in uncharted territory. But the bottom line is that the notion of a surgical, some kind of limited intervention, those days are behind us. And the other part of it is North Korean statements basically saying that the conventional side, retaliating at the conventional level where there's a threshold even before they consider using nuclear, that's another element where it's not just nuclear exchange. There could be the conventional. And one of the eerie statements from the 2010 period where North Korea conducted 2 provocations against South Korea, the statement was, who would dare retaliate against a nuclear weapon state? The sense that you can lash out conventionally, but ultimately the nuclear arsenal would dissuade others from carrying out even a conventional attack against North Korea. That is, I think, the mindset that's probably even grown larger with the more recent tests.
And for those interested in this issue, and it really is a critical one, our friends at Plowshares are doing some very important work and support on this front. I'd also encourage you to look up what Jeffrey Lewis is doing out in Monterey and the recent comments by former Defense Secretary William Perry, who has taken a very strong position on this and has had some very wise advice and cautionaries on how all of this is developing. So check out Bill Perry's comments from Stanford University. There also have been comments that Bill Perry, Henry Kissinger, and George Shultz all offered up on Capitol Hill as well that touched on this area of concern in terms of the broader nonproliferation regime. Please, we have time for 1 or 2 more. Our friends from the China mission to the United Nations.
My name is Sim Ma. I work with the China mission to UN. My question to the speaker is that, to your analysis, if the engagement takes place this time between United States and the DPRK, what is the favorable approach of this administration? Maybe the DPRK just wants to talk with the United States bilaterally. Maybe the U.S. In favor the trilateral, 2 Koreans and the United States. To your analysis, what is the difference of this round of engagement between U.S. and the DPRK from previous rounds? Thank you.
Thank you. The U.S. administration has been very direct and very clear that it's the goal of denuclearization. Doesn't really matter what the dialogue channel is, but to seek, initially, the preference is for peaceful denuclearization. And so with that, I think the direct angle of it, and I don't see much wiggle room, that's the basis of, I think, the challenge for South Korea's overall task here to try to get a dialogue channel going, where with the U.S. bar that high, how much North Korea is willing to enter into to start doing this kind of broader exploratory talks and seeing if there's a basis for further negotiations, it could be over very quick. And so that's the part that we have to manage expectations as well. But from the U.S. side, the events of July, it's a very, very strong new marker in terms of the North Korean threat and how it's being framed and how it's being dealt with right now.
And one last question. Please. Why don't we take two quick questions? Why don't you ask, and then we'll let John answer both your questions.
Yes, Ozan Gurel, member. About planning for regime change. South Korea has a Ministry of Unification. What are they doing?
Okay, and then let's take one more, and then we'll wrap up. Right in the front row.
Hi, Ben Moore. I play left field, so I'm going to ask the question from there. I think there's a perception among a lot of Americans who aren't here that we're not sure why North Korea's and South Korea's conflict is our problem. And all we know is we're going to nuke the North if this doesn't get settled in our way. Now, those people don't get much of a voice except at the polls, and we've seen what happens. So in lieu of the option B that was implied there, how far out of this could the United States pull so as to not be seen as the rogue, high-risk actor on the world stage? I mean, what could the rest, if we walked out tomorrow, troops, arms, everything, what do you speculate would happen? Again, left field.
Very quickly, Unification Minister Cho has been very active. He was the lead negotiator in getting the inter-Korean dialogues going January 9th. So Kim Jong-un's New Year's Day speech, very quickly the South Koreans set the conditions conducive to the beginning of the inter-Korean dialogues. And the Unification Ministry has been a coordinating aspect also of the delegation that went to Pyongyang and met with Kim Jong-un as well. So now they're playing a large role. And traditionally, it's been Unification Ministry and the National Intelligence Service that have been playing the coordinating role in preparing and conducting these types of exchanges at the highest level, in some instances culminating in, a summit between the two leaders. To the part of U.S. public perception, certainly the framing of the threat is real. And on top of that, every time North Korea did one of those tests last year, 2017, the North Koreans posted the videos and the photos on the internet. And this is high resolution, good stuff. So colleagues that Stephen mentioned, Monterey, the group out there, they've been using a lot of sleuthing and technology to come up with ranges. And they come out very quickly. So the North Korean nuclear crisis now compared to previous time periods, there's almost been this democratization of intelligence. Before something happened, classified, and we had to rely on the assessments of the White House at that given time. Now everyone has access to what's happening. So the threat, the North Koreans getting better, that's documented by a lot of international groups, not at the nation state level. So with that, there is a source of concern. But if the United States were to, as you point out, that scenario, withdraw their troops, right now the focus isn't military exercises and boots on the ground and a ground war. The discussion of bloody nose and potentially U.S. military action is about airstrikes. You need to, from the military calculation, if you're going to do it, you have to be decisive, has to be very quick. So it's more of what's happening in terms of U.S. aircraft carrier groups that are off the waters of the Korean Peninsula and how they've been conducting their preparations and operations to be ready if they're called upon to act. So from that perspective, it's qualitatively different, I think, from previous cycles of escalation. And in terms of expectations, they're being managed. The U.S. administration framing of it is the North Koreans are being given opportunities to denuclearize peacefully. But if there is war, it's on the North Korean regime's side. They're going to be the reason responsible for it. That's the formulation right now.
Dr. John Park of Harvard University, thank you. And we look forward to continuing this relationship and hearing of your good work up at Harvard and the Kennedy School. And do keep the Korea Society in mind. Thank you all for your kindness today, for your attention, for literally weathering this. And for those of you who have joined us via live stream or listening on audio podcasts or viewing on YouTube, thank you for joining us for this program. And do check back often at koreasociety.org for membership and more. We have representatives from our team here in the back of the room if you'd like to sign up for Korea Society membership. I'd also like to extend to John the warm greetings from Ambassador Thomas Hubbard, our chairman, and President Thomas Byrne, both of whom are in Seoul now with our colleague Angela, doing good work at a very critical time to help the relationship between the United States and South Korea. And I would be remiss not to mention at least a few of our funders and supporters, to include the Korea Foundation, the Kim Koo Foundation, Hyundai Motors, Samsung, and others who give so generously to support the work of the Korea Society. For those listening or viewing, if you would like to pursue corporate membership, please do contact our team here at the Korea Society. And finally, thanks to Jonathan Corrado and our team, and to Peter Stemke and our audio visual booth for all of their great work. You can find our audio podcast and other e-opportunities online again at koreasociety.org. We will see you soon, and to peace and progress on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you all. Dr. John Park.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you.